All right, so hello and welcome back. I should sound better. I have a new setup kind of thingamajigger there. Anyway, so today we're going to be reacting to what happened in Africa during the Cold War by the Armchair Historian. I haven't actually seen this video, waiting to react to it. Should be very interesting. Again, go check out their links in the description because they make very good work that you should go check out. Also, my stuff's down there, but yeah. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. It can sometimes be easy to forget the truly global nature of the Cold War. From Norway to Argentina, not a single political entity escaped the attention of these superpowers as they struggled for dominance between 1945 and 1991. An often overlooked theater of the Cold War is the continent of Africa, whose fate hung in the balance after over a century of European dominance. In this video, we'll focus on the impact of US and Soviet political, economic, and military interventions in Africa, and how they affected the process of decolonization. We'll also see how the Europeans reacted to the various nationalist and socialist movements that emerged during this period, and how the stubbornness of some colonial powers resulted in some of the most brutal conflicts in history.
So yes, this is very true, right? So Africa was very mainly forgotten in the Cold War, and even I don't really know much about it. What I do know about it, so let's just take our colonial examples from 1945 to before decolonization was complete. France, the UK, too, and then you have Belgium, okay, and then not in Africa, not technically in Africa, but you have the Dutch. They're doing their own thing in Indonesia, and these places were still colonized by these main powers. And being capitalist in Africa was, at least from what I know, like if the U.S. is going to send an aid package to Angola, it's not going to be as effective as the Soviets doing so. And the main reason is because communism has a lot more political pull in lower income areas. Okay, and Africa was very low income at this time. Also, the fact that segregation wasn't really a thing in the Soviet Union versus America, between whites and blacks in America, and the Soviet Union didn't really have this, but they also didn't have black people, Africans. They just didn't have them in the Soviet Union, so they had a lot more bonding in the communist side, which he might get into. I have no idea, so let's keep watching.
It is important to note that this is not an exhaustive analysis of the topic, as there is only so much we can cover in a single video. The Second World War was instrumental in breaking the stranglehold of colonialism in Africa. After 6 years of conflict, the British Empire was an exhausted shadow of its former self, while the French Republic was left in deep political and social turmoil after the Nazi occupation.
So just to put this in perspective, how bankrupt Britain was, right? None of their ships that are big, no battleships, no carriers, nothing. No battle cruisers. I think they might have a heavy cruiser and maybe some light cruisers from World War II, but they're very sparingly. All the rest of them were scrapped because that's how bad the economy was in Britain. They were still on rations for a good while too. I think until 49. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's until 49, but maybe even longer for rationing still in Britain. I don't know about the U.S. side of that, but yeah. Let's just say the economy of France was worse than Britain, and Britain's was pretty bad.
With the great colonial powers now at their weakest, the Africans quickly realized the importance of currying favor with the United States and the Soviet Union, whose influence could easily determine the success or failure of any independence movement. Though neither of these superpowers had a direct say in African affairs, they could exert considerable influence via the United Nations, which they had jointly founded alongside 50 other member states in June of 1945.
What he's talking about there is because the UN has one vote, one country, um, which basically gives a lot of these nations in Africa. So let's just say, for example, the U.S. and the Soviet Union each are considered one vote. Now, I'm not getting into the Security Council debate because both of them can veto, but let's just take that aside for a fact. So all these countries in Africa that do join the UN, they get one vote for one nation. So technically, if the veto power is not exercised by the U.S. and Soviet Union, these new nations have a lot of political power they can pull around for the UN, right? Because they can slow 25 votes to the U.S., 25 votes to the Soviets. It depends on what they're doing, okay? And if you do this in modern day politics, which I don't get into much, but it's the same reason why like Samoa and all these little island nations, if China can buy them all up, right, they start supporting them in the UN, and then there's 5 votes right there for 5 different countries. Even though they're very tiny, they matter. That's I can see why they would do that.
The first major example of UN interference in Africa occurred when the fate of the former colonies of the defeated Italian Empire was called into question. Italian territories in Libya, Somaliland, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the rest of East Africa had been placed under Allied military administration after the end of the war, and many expected that at least some of these lands would be divided up between Britain and France in the coming years. But in 1949, the UN General Assembly endorsed Libyan independence, resulting in the creation of the United Kingdom of Libya 2 years later. The British had recognized the full sovereignty of Ethiopia in 1944, and Emperor Haile Selassie returned to power once the Italians were driven out of the country.
Which is very important to remember because Eritrea and then Somaliland is down near Somalia, and Ethiopia did fight them in 36 and 35. Sorry, my bad. 36 and 35 against the Italians when they invaded. And I believe they were one of the very few, if maybe only, people that were not colonized in Africa, which says something. And then Libya, of course, gained independence because that was an Italian territory before World War II. Yeah.
Eritrea would then become part of the Ethiopian Empire in 1952, while Somaliland and East Africa were put under their own paths to self-governance by UN oversight committees. Unfortunately, a majority of these mergers or integrations would merely set the stage for the divided, poverty-stricken Africa that trudged into the 21st century. While
True, when you start drawing lines on a map because you think it looks pretty, then you start getting problems.
the UN was quietly limbering up in preparation for full-scale decolonization, France was busy providing a case study on how not to hold on to colonial territories.
Yeah, Indochina was going fantastic for France at this point.
After becoming completely bogged down in the First Indochina War with Vietnam, the Republic then received another massive blow from an explosive rebellion in 1950.
So yeah, Algeria also on there. So I'll read this. Algeria was considered part of metropolitan France by France and not a colony. So this means it's a part of the actual state of France. It had been owned by France for over a century and had a significant population of 13%, of French 13%, going up as high as 60% in some urban areas like Oran. If I remember correctly, the the Algerian War for France lasted until the 60s, maybe 69. Quite a long war, actually. And it lasted a lot longer for France, I believe, than Indochina. But I could be wrong because France was in Indochina a very long time and fighting a lot of different rebellions. It depends on where you start the line, obviously.
Blow from an explosive rebellion in 1952 in Algeria, one of France's oldest colonial territories. The rebels were known as the National Liberation Front, whose leaders were highly active in the international community, denouncing French treatment of the native Muslim population.
Now, this is just something funny you might see, is NLF, so National Liberation Front, is used by a lot of rebellions called NLF. NLF is National Liberation Front. It's used by a lot of different rebel groups.
And selectively courting the favor of both the Soviet Union and the United States for their own ends. The uprising coincided with unrest in the French holdings of Tunisia and Morocco, forcing the Republic to grant both independence in 1956.
Okay, so let me talk about Morocco for a little bit. So, France, I think before World War II, was having problems, and maybe even World War I. They were having problems because they couldn't fully control Morocco. Because of basically the mountain ranges. They were able to, a lot of the rebels were able to sit behind the mountain ranges, and France was able to control basically the exterior, or the lines, which were plains. So France has always had a problem with this area. This is nothing new. I'm assuming it's new because they got a lot more guns, and the Soviet Union and the United States apparently was backing them. I'd like to hear why the United States was backing them, because fighting in Indochina for France and then supporting the Algeria. Yeah.
so that resources could be diverted to Algeria. Throughout the 7-year conflict, both sides committed blatant atrocities, murdering civilians, assassinating prominent officials, and making liberal use of torture. By 1958, most of the international community had turned against the French administration, and in an effort to hold on to the jewel of their colonial empire, the military orchestrated what amounted to a coup by demanding Charles de Gaulle become the next French president. With little bargaining power, the French parliament agreed, and de Gaulle immediately set about solidifying his hold on Algeria by holding a referendum on Algerian independence. Completely distraught at this perceived betrayal, several generals controlling paratrooper divisions in Algeria and the French Foreign Legion attempted another coup, only for the effort to collapse thanks to a lack of general army support.
Yeah, they were fighting Charles de Gaulle at this point. I mean, he is quoted as the savior of France. So there's a whole bunch of shit you can get into with Charles de Gaulle, whether he was good or bad or whatever the fuck he did. But they have the Paris airport is named Charles de Gaulle, so having the military turn on him is, not going to really happen.
Algeria would gain its sovereignty in 1962, prompting more than
So I was wrong. 1962 the war ended, not 1969.
Million French Algerians, Jews, and Muslim Algerians who served in the French army to flee to France. The 1950s also played host to the Suez Canal crisis, which would highlight to the entire world that the former colonial powers were now playing second fiddle to the United States and Soviet Union.
Just before he gets into the Suez Canal, basically, it's a very important canal at this point, and France and Britain obviously don't want, because the Egyptian president was trying to nationalize it for Egypt and not have it under French and British control anymore. And that led to the crisis, and France and Britain were about to go in, and the U.S. said, you need to stop this, or we're not supporting you in any way, shape, or form. And they did, so.
In 1952, Egypt's pro-British Muhammad Ali dynasty had been overthrown in a coup orchestrated by army officers Mohammed Naguib and Jamal Abdel Nasser. By 1954, Nasser had become president of the new Arab Republic of Egypt and was a strong proponent of pan-Arabism and Arab socialism, as well as an open
Republic. We will say, I will leave it there.
Supporter of the Algerian independence movement. Having spent most of his early reign antagonizing both Britain and France, Nasser went one step further on the 26th of July 1956 when he nationalized the Suez Canal Company. When the Egyptians went so far as to
Yes, I'll read this. This is the huge power play as the Suez Canal was arguably the most strategic important waterway on Earth connecting the economies together. It still is today. And yes, he basically nationalized the company. Which he'll probably might get into, but basically nationalizing the ability for Egypt to gain money out of the canal. Because it is in their country. But if I remember correctly, it was a national zone beforehand, administered by France and Britain. We might get into it, but I'm not really sure. But wasn't under Egyptian control fully.
Ban Israeli shipping through the canal, Britain, France, and Israel formed a military coalition to
I forgot Israel. They were also part of it.
Invade Egypt, depose Nasser, and restore the status quo. But the three powers made a critical mistake right at the outset by failing to consult with either of these superpowers before launching their invasion. And when Nasser began sinking ships in the canal to try and render it useless, both superpowers became enraged. President Dwight D. Eisenhower blamed the coalition for escalating the situation without US input, and the Soviets were quite ready to use the threat of nuclear war as a bargaining chip to stop the Israeli advance. Opposed by all sides, the three nations begrudgingly agreed to withdraw. The strong arming of the two oldest and most powerful European nations, combined with Nasser's massive propaganda victory in successfully holding the Suez Canal, came as a huge shock to the international community. Rather than uphold European claims, the United States and the Soviet Union had both pushed for non-interference in African affairs, despite Nasser's continued support of the Algerian NLF. This would embolden the Egyptian regime and cause Pan-Arabism to expand its influence dramatically, contributing greatly to the Arabian nationalist spirit in North Africa. Nasser was also a prominent figure in the Bandung Conference of 1955, which brought the leaders of 6 African and 23 Asian countries together to discuss cooperation in various economic and geopolitical matters. This conference was a defining moment for African engagement in the Cold War.
It's important to remember, right? Because this is one of the very few victories, and that's why Nasser is remembered today, is because of this as a hero. Yeah, you nationalize your own thing. It's in your own country. It's just like the Panama Canal wasn't technically under Panama for a very long time, even though it was in their country. And yeah, it's very important because this is also a third player now, kind of, between the Soviet Union and U.S., right? They're trying to become a third, just economic zone rather than having to fully support the Soviet Union or the U.S. They can become their own thing. It's a pretty good idea, actually.
A vital point of discussion at the Bandung Conference was how the various nations involved would deal with the superpowers. The United States refused to send representatives to the conference out of fear of alienating the various NATO powers who still maintained large colonial territories. But
yeah, France, Britain, Belgium, maybe at this point. Netherlands. If you really want to get into other colonies, then you can include the Scandinavian countries too, but yeah, you get the point.
Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai attended in person. Although the various nationalist movements throughout Africa had often received communist support, Zhou realized that expansion in Africa would be both a drain on resources and potentially spark war with the colonial powers. Zhou therefore adopted a moderate tone, encouraging the delegates to choose their future without external interference. At the end of the conference, the 29 nations agreed to unilaterally condemn colonialism and work together in future endeavors. The Bandung Conference was a major first step in the eventual creation of the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, the non-aligned movement was basically the third power of the Cold War that's not really talked about. Yeah.
Representing 55% of the global population. As Africa moved into the 1960s, decolonization was in full swing. Of particular interest were the Belgian territories of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi.
Yeah, so Belgium was still here, in fact.
Having witnessed the French failure to hold on to Algeria, the Belgians decide to decolonize all 3 regions, starting with the Congo in 1960.
Now, it's deceptively how big the Congo is. I want you to take a look. Just look at how big this thing is. So this is the Mercator map. It's deceptively how big this just country is. And you can see it barely has any access to the outside world. It's almost landlocked. And you can see that this is not going to go very well when you just, this is ours, and then, have each different tribal group and ethnic group in this country, and they don't get along. And then Rwanda, you know what happens there.
The newly elected Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was condemned by the CIA as a communist infiltrator, which led to the West denying him support when the Katanga region rose in rebellion against his attempts to centralize power. Desperate for aid, Lumumba turned to the Soviets, an act which merely led to his own deposal and eventual assassination in 1961.
The CIA doing CIA things.
Lumumba's replacement was Joseph Kasavubu, who was much more amenable to Western cooperation than his predecessor, and quickly received UN aid to quell the Katanga rebellion. But just as elections were called, a communist militia group known as the Simbas seized control of Stanleyville and declared a People's Republic of Congo. Just as Kasavubu prepared to deal with this threat, another communist militia known as the Kilwus appeared to wreak more havoc on the citizens of the Congo. By 1964, combined Congolese, Belgium, and US military operations had quelled the insurrections, but the prolonged conflict left the Congo so unstable that a former sergeant called Joseph Mobutu was able to launch a military coup d'etat only a year later.
A sergeant. That's impressive.
After easily taking control of the government, Mobutu renamed the Congo to Zaire and proceeded to rule as a deeply corrupt autocrat. Mobutu took a hardline anti-communist stance, leading to his regime being propped up by America and the CIA until the end of the Cold War.
And you can now know that it is no longer called Zaire today.
Another region that experienced communist uprisings was Eritrea, whose people had never been happy with Ethiopian rule and eventually united behind the Eritrean Liberation Front, or ELF, supplied by China. The 700-year-old Ethiopian Empire would come crashing down abruptly in 1974 when a military junta known as the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie and established a Marxist-Leninist communist state. But despite receiving considerable support from the USSR, the Derg administration was just as hopelessly corrupt as the CIA-backed dictatorships in other parts of Africa. Rebel groups in the late 80s would dismantle it after leading the once proud nation to total economic ruin.
It's kind of sad how that happened to Ethiopia, honestly.
Not all of the conflicts in Africa during the 1960s could be clearly defined by Cold War politics. Chief among them was the tangled mess created by the Nigerian Civil War, which began when the Igbo people declared the independent Republic of Biafra after enduring decades of racial persecution. Nigeria was both a former British colony and a major oil exporter during the Suez Crisis, leading to the British government cynically supporting General Yakubu Gowon's military dictatorship while France championed the Igbo cause.
Yeah, this is one of those things where France and Britain were fighting each other by supplying each other's enemies, yeah.
The ongoing Sino-Soviet split that began in the mid-1960s also meant that the Chinese sided with Biafra, while the USSR backed Nigeria.
Yeah, and the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s is very important to remember because before this, they were technically aligned because Mao liked Stalin. He did not like Khrushchev and where the Soviet Union was going, and so called them basically not communists. And then they split. And it's a very important split because they really didn't work with each other after that. They mean they work theoretically should work together, but not really. And China did its own thing until like the 90s, more or less.
The United States, meanwhile, maintained pro-Biafra neutrality, with Richard Nixon declaring Gowon's blockade of food supplies to the Igbo an attempted genocide. The 2.5 years of war would result in a government victory, at the cost of well over 2 million Igbo deaths from famine and at least 60,000 military casualties. On the opposite end of the political spectrum,
I forgot about Portugal. Oh, come on, man. Oh, damn it. Yeah, but Portugal is also a colonial power in Angola. Apparently Angola, which I didn't really know.
Portuguese colony of Angola experienced a period of violent unrest between the 1950s and 1960s thanks to the efforts of several rebel groups funded directly by the capitalist powers. A major figure was Holden Roberto, leader of the Union of the Peoples of Angola, or UPA guerrilla army, and in the direct pay of the United States, despite being notorious for slaughtering thousands of innocent white and black Africans and pillaging any regions that fell under his control. After merging the UPA with the Democratic Party of Angola, Roberto
Democratic Republic, the People's Republic, all of this stuff, and then, yeah, it then becomes corrupted, imagine.
Formed a government in exile.
So read this. After multiple unsuccessful attempts to crush native independence moves under the European powers were under pressure from the United Nations to adopt a more conciliatory attitude towards colonial citizens. Makes sense.
And an alliance with Zaire. Despite intense pressure from the UN, Portugal continued fighting back against the guerrillas, but as casualties mounted, the war became increasingly unpopular at home, and in 1974, the Carnation Revolution overthrew the Portuguese government and allowed their overseas territories to gain full independence.
If I remember correctly, one of the main reasons was because Portugal introduced conscription to go fight this thing. If I remember correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong if I have any Portuguese subscribers, but I believe it was conscription, and yeah, when you start sending people that don't want to be there to a country that is trying to gain independence, and you're like, no, and you're like, I don't want to be there, it starts, pissing everyone off.
Naturally, this resulted in yet more violence when the Communist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, took the opportunity to seize power, causing an exodus of the white population. The ensuing Angolan Civil War was yet another proxy conflict between these superpowers, with the MPLA receiving thousands of troops from Cuba.
The MPLA, if you get that reference from Black Ops.
And military support from the Soviets. Meanwhile, South Africa and the United States poured money into the various opposition groups throughout the country. The Angolan Civil War was also intricately tied to the South African Border War, fought between apartheid South Africa and Namibia, a former German colony occupied by the South Africans at the end of the First World War. Rather unsurprisingly, the apartheid regime itself was firmly in the anti-communist camp when it came to Cold War politics, making the Southwest African People's Organization that rose against them in Namibia a prime target for Soviet support. The MPLA would also maintain ties with the Namibian independence movement, resulting in South African forces routinely crossing into Angolan territory to conduct reprisals. Having been independent from Britain since 1931, South Africa was easily the strongest power on the continent.
This is very true. You can also quote as most stable government in Africa at this time. There are various reasons for that I don't want to get into, but it is the important thing that it was probably the most powerful economically in Africa at this time.
Going so far as to start its own nuclear program in 1967. As a major exporter of arms and training to pro-Western forces in other parts of the continent, the regime viewed itself as a primary participant in the international struggle to contain communism. Yet despite the government banning communist organizations in 1950, the South African Communist Party would remain a powerful underground force for the entire Cold War, before eventually re-emerging to become part of the new tripartite alliance with the African National Congress and the Congress of South African Trade Unions after the end of apartheid in 1994. Back in Angola, the Civil War raged on for 25 years.
That's mind, 1975 to 2002, that's mind-bogglingly long. Especially for a modern conflict, especially a civil war.
Before culminating in the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale in 1987.
Okay, yeah, so the war was divided into three major phases from fighting, from 1975 to 1991. That's still a very long time. 1992 to 1994, 2 years, and then from 1998 to 2000. I was born in 1998, so 2002 was a fragile peace period, so yeah.
This was the largest battle fought on the continent since the Second World War, involving as many as 90,000 soldiers and lasting for over 7 months. By the time it ended, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola had dealt a decisive blow against the communist-backed People's Republic of Angola, leading to peace talks that would finally end the fighting after over 800,000 deaths. Horribly enough, the Angolan Civil War wasn't even the only bloody conflict fought by a former Portuguese colony, as Mozambique had descended into its own civil conflict in 1977. Yet again, the war was fought between communist and anti-communist guerrilla movements and
77 and 1990, these are extremely long wars for independence.
Resulted in over 1 million deaths and 5 million displaced refugees. The last part of Africa we have time to discuss today that experienced terrible interracial violence during the Cold War was southern Rhodesia, whose government declared independence from Britain in 1965 in an effort to delay a planned transition of power to the black majority.
Yeah, so South Rhodesia became Rhodesian. Basically, it was South Africa on steroids with the terms of racism, where basically it was just white people everywhere that were in power and black people had zero rights. And yeah, then they fought the Bush War. And there's a whole thing you could do about that, especially on the SAS side for Rhodesia and South Africa, because South Africa sent guns and stuff. There's a whole thing you could do on that.
In response, the Soviet-backed Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Chinese-backed Zimbabwe African National Union launched an armed insurgency. The latter had strong ties to the Mozambique Liberation Front and even operated out of Zambia, while the Rhodesian government would receive military aid from South Africa and Portugal. Many foreign volunteers from countries like Britain and America would also side with Rhodesia, and for a time, they fought a successful campaign against the guerrillas.
They did, and this was mainly because they actually had a pretty decent military. It's a small country as it is, and it also was completely cut off from the international community. And South Africa eventually had to stop recognizing them, if I remember correctly, but they still sent them aid. But yeah, they had actually a pretty decent and effective military, and yeah, when you have that, I mean, it's not hard to hold on to power that way.
However, things would change rapidly after the MLF was victorious in their home country, and Soviet-made ground-to-air missiles began finding their way into the hands of insurgents. In an effort to halt the bloodshed, Prime Minister Ian Smith ended white majority rule and allowed the country to be renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia with a black majority government. However, neither ZAPU or ZANU were satisfied, forcing Britain to step in and place Rhodesia under administration until free elections could be held. Said elections resulted in ZANU leader Robert Mugabe rising to the presidency in 1980.
I hear the word Mugabe, and I already know it's going to be bad.
Whereupon he renamed the country Zimbabwe. But this failed to stop the violence, and clashes between ZANU and ZAPU forces would continue until 1987, when the two groups settled their few remaining differences and merged into a single entity. The cost of this struggle would be the lives of around 20,000 civilians and 11,000 military personnel on both sides. By the time the Cold War drew to a close in the early 90s, Africa had played host to several major proxy conflicts. Early on, the Soviet Union and China repeatedly attempted to establish a beachhead on the continent, hoping that a single strong communist regime could influence the newly formed post-colonial states to form a greater socialist union.
That never happened. Even today, it's still I think there's an African like coalition force thing that they're still trying to get off the ground. I don't even know if it's off the ground, but yeah, there was no single entity that could be. There's no single country like South Africa for the USSR or the Chinese. Or basically, there was no communist version of South Africa in Africa just to go and support all these people like the West had for South Africa. It makes sense why they would try to support that. The only thing they could come close maybe is Nasser's government, but Nasser's government in Egypt, but even then he's more nationalistic than he was communist. So.
But as time went on, it became clear that the African people had been far too negatively influenced by colonialism to tolerate direct rule from either superpower. In the north, Arab socialism found fertile ground in Egypt and Libya, leading to the regimes of men like Abd al-Nasser and Muammar al-Gaddafi, the latter of whom later became a huge proponent of Pan-Africanism, alongside other figures like Robert Mugabe. Tragically, the constant meddling of the superpowers in Africa and the sloppy, haphazard nature of colonialism also exacerbated existing tensions between native racial groups, leading to events like the Rwandan genocide of the mid-90s and the subsequent Second Congo War, the deadliest conflict since the Second World War.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that again, even today, most of the countries in Africa are still the lines that were drawn when they did colonization, when they drew up the borders in I think the 1800s. In the I can't remember the term for it, but I remember it was Berlin Conference where they divide up Africa, and the lines are still pretty basically similar. If you look at that map and look today, I mean it's basically still what it is, and obviously those lines were drawn with basically zero regard for tribal and a whole bunch of other stuff. Tribal, ethnic lines, a whole bunch of things you can get into. So I hope you enjoyed my reaction to this. This is a very good video, and I think you should go give them a like and support them. Again, my links or stuff are below. Otherwise, I'd like to hear your feedback on this video, and maybe leave some more video suggestions for me to react to. Otherwise, I will see you people next time.